Good afternoon. Welcome to today's TASA webinar, Survey Research Methods, Planning and Designing a Survey. Survey Research Methods is the third installment of a three-part webinar series, Statistical Tools for Attorneys in Litigation. In Part 1, we covered Introduction to Data, and in Part 2, the Basic Tools. These programs were presented on March 4th and May 8th, respectively. Part 3, Survey Research Methods, is composed of 4 phases: planning and designing a survey, developing survey instruments, collecting and processing data, and interpreting and reporting results. During this program, Planning and Designing a Survey, the presenter will cover the first 3 of 12 critically important steps. Specifically, he will cover initiating a survey, planning a project, and constructing questionnaires. The presenter for today's program is Dr. Jack ReVelle. Jack is a consulting statistician with a PhD in industrial engineering and management from Oklahoma State University. Dr. ReVelle provides his technical assistance in both quality and industrial engineering to attorneys involved in many cases. We will take 2 question and answer breaks during today's program. Please use the chat feature and/or Q&A feature on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions to the presenter. Tomorrow morning, I will send out an email with a link to the archived recording of this program. We do ask that you take time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after today's program is over. And now I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm going to turn the program over to our distinguished presenter, Dr. Jack ReVelle. Jack, the PowerPoint is loaded and ready to go.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, depending on where you are. Matt, could you tell me what slide is up there that the folks are looking at?
Sure, it's the cover slide, the Statistical Tools for Attorney in Litigation.
Okay, let's go over to number 2.
Okay.
And folks, that's my background. I've been in and out of the quality and industrial engineering business for the better part of 30 years, and my primary love is and has been the application of statistics, applied statistics in the world of litigation. I've enjoyed working with a number of different TASA attorneys, helping them to resolve issues that have required litigation. We'll move over to slide number 3. In this case, Matt has already mentioned to you that we've done 2 earlier seminars about an introduction to statistics, all about data, and then we covered some basic statistical tools. Today we start a 4-phase series. This is Part 3, Survey Research Methods. Okay. On slide number 4, this tells you we're starting Survey Research Methods. On slide number 5 and 6, we're looking at slide 5, Phase 1. We have 3 items that we're going to cover today, 3 sections, 3 units: initiating a survey, planning a project, and designing a sample. In the following presentations, we'll begin with Phase 2, and we'll cover 4, composing a question, 5, creating item scales, and 6, constructing questionnaires. Later on in the series, in the third of this series on survey research methods, we'll go into Phase 3, collecting and processing data. Then we'll talk about items 7, 8, and 9, mail data collection, and that could be either snail mail or email, gathering interview data, and 9, processing the data. Finally, the fourth of the 4 phases in this discussion on survey research methods will be number 10, analyzing the results, interpreting statistics, and finally reporting the information. Okay, now that takes care of all the marketing. That's what we're talking about in this 4-phase series on survey research methods. So today, we're going to do Phase 1, planning and designing a survey. That's slide number 7. So let's begin our discussion of what's going on here. On slide number 8, initiating a survey. First of all, we ask the question, why are surveys conducted as opposed to enumeration or census? Well, sometimes it's the only way to get information. It is easier, quicker, and certainly less expensive to get the information you need to prove your case. And believe it or not, even though it's a sample, that means it's less than a 100% census, it is more accurate than a census. And I'm more than happy to prove it to anybody that would like to see the proof. Then we talk about what are our expectations of survey results. When surveys are superior to other techniques, of course. The roles of the participants. There are different aspects of projects that have special roles. And finally, potential survey topics. Some potential survey topics still on slide 8 is attitudes, knowledge, feelings, actions, behaviors, lifestyles, affiliations, and demographics. These are all topics that attorneys are interested in getting information on depending on the case that they're working with. Now, moving over to slide number 9, still talking about initiating a survey, let's kind of summarize this general topic. First, we want to evaluate a survey's potential. The same measurement methods are useful for many occupations and needs. Next, maintain realistic expectations. Survey research is neither impossibly difficult nor precisely definitive. Third, expect and evaluate errors. Minor mistakes may affect some results, but they seldom ever invalidate all results. Next, recognize the potential topics. They indicate what can be measured and suggest ways to obtain information. Next to last, allow for other topics. The list provided here is not all-inclusive, and others might be used productively. Finally, on slide 9, consider suggestions carefully. The methods of measurement identified here are thoroughly tested. Okay, we'll move over now to slide number 10, and we'll look at the second topic. And in this second topic, we're talking about planning a project. First, we'll address the subject of the survey process. It's a series of a series of steps linked to one another, as you'll see on the next slide, number 11, but we're still on 10. So it's a series of steps linked to one another where decisions are made in early stages that affect later stages. Some of the major steps are, what are the information needs? What should be our sampling design? We'll talk about sampling design at some length here in just a few minutes. What are our instrumentation needs? How about data collection? How will that be accomplished? How will the data processing be taken care of? And what's the report generation process? Which, by the way, is the most expensive step, speaking of data collection. That requires a lot of time, a lot of effort, and certainly is the most expensive. But now let's turn our attention back to these major steps in the survey process, and we'll switch over to slide 11, entitled The Major Steps in the Survey Process. Looking at the diagonal going across the slide from top left to bottom right, we start out with information needs. That's the first major step. Then we talk about sampling design, followed by instrumentation, followed by data collection, followed by data processing, and finally report generation. And as you can see in the legend up near the top right, the solid lines are the forward links going from the first steps to the last steps, and the dashed line is the backward links, which is feedback from a step or phase that has just been completed, providing information back to an earlier step, so as to make sure that this iterative activity that we're going through provides the necessary information both forward and backward. Moving on to slide number 12, we're talking about specifying information needs. The information needs are determined as the result of a dialogue between the attorney and a consulting statistician. The needs must be listed in concrete and specific terms. Generalities just don't work in a situation like this, especially as you get further and further into the planning of the project. Now, as I mentioned earlier, surveys can measure things such as attitudes, images, decisions, behaviors, affiliations, and demographics. Now, over on slide 13, still talking about planning a project. We plan the survey elements, of which there are 10 in the survey process. First, indicate information needs by priority. Not everything is of equal importance or equal value, which means we need to indicate the value of the information. Now, you might say, well, how do I know, how much something is worth? Well, but you can in this case categorize it as high value, medium value, or low value to help you in the prioritization process. Number 3, we want to identify internal resource requirements. 4, we want to specify the sample size, and that's a lowercase n. Those of you who participated in the first 2 webinars that I did for TASA earlier this year, 2012, know that sample size n, lowercase n, is commonly used, where the population size is an uppercase n. So we specify the sample size and the design. Now let's talk a few minutes about sampling design options. I'd like to talk about 6 items: random, convenience, stratified, unstratified, clustered, and unclustered. Now I'll try and keep this as simple as possible. When we're talking about a sampling design, if it's random, every sample unit in the population has an equal chance of being selected. The sample represents the population well. The probability of sampling error can validly be computed statistically. That means every single unit has an equal opportunity of being selected, no matter what the previous item selected was or what the following item selected is going to be. Now let's compare that with convenience sampling. In convenience sampling, some sample units have a greater chance of being selected than others. The sample's representation of the population is inferior. It's invalid to compute the probability of a sampling error. So if you're comparing random versus convenient, you can see that while convenience is certainly a tremendous asset, it's going to cost you a lot of money, and at the same time, you're not going to get the kind of results that you're looking for that you would get with a random design. Now let's compare stratified designs versus unstratified. With a stratified design, the proportion of various types of sample units in the sample is controlled by selecting a series of subsamples of specified sizes. Stratification meaning, for example, if you're looking at ages, you may have age 17 and under, age 18 to 25, 26 to 30. You're stratifying it by age, or you may stratify it by gender, or you may stratify it by education, or stratify it by any one of a number of different factors that are pertinent to the particular study that you're having your statistician conduct. This is as opposed to unstratified designs. The proportions of various types of sample units will be approximately the same in the sample as they are in the entire population. So that's a comparison of stratified versus unstratified designs. Now, one last comparison. Clustered designs versus unclustered designs. Now, when I speak of clusters, we're talking about a series of physical or geographical areas which are selected, then a specific number of sample units are selected proportionally from each cluster. Now, you may wonder, what do I mean by a physical or geographical area? Well, if you're talking about geographical, we're talking about clusters by streets, or neighborhoods, or cities, or states, depending on the nature of the case that you're working on. If you're working on something, say, within an organization, you may be talking about clusters that are like departments, or floors in a building, or buildings in a collection of buildings that belong to a particular organization. So those are clusters, as opposed to unclustered designs where respondents are randomly selected or by convenience, regardless of their physical or geographical location. Now there's pros and cons for each one of these. You can have a random stratified sample design with clusters or without clusters, or you can use convenience sampling that's been stratified. There's all kinds of different combinations. I just wanted to bring to your attention the fact that these 6 different sample design options are available, and you should discuss these with your statistician as you are designing whatever kind of analysis survey that you're looking for. Now, having said that, let's move on to slide number 14, which is also on planning a project. This is the 4th slide in the sequence. We're talking about project costs and timing. We want to determine in advance project cost and the survey time schedule. Then we want to talk about the final project planning, where each element fits together and is compatible with all the other elements. It's always advisable to express the elements of a project plan in written form. When approved by the attorney, the plan serves as a basis for the agreement or the contract for survey project work to be performed by the statistician. The worst thing for both the statistician and the attorney, and the two of them together, is that there's a disagreement as you get into the operation of the project because you did not have it written down in a clear cut. It's literally a contract. And if anybody in the world understands contracts, it's you folks, the attorneys. And you need to have that contract or agreement with your statistician to make sure that what you're looking for is what you're going to get. Well, that completes what I wanted to say about planning a project. So let's summarize it on slide number 15. On slide number 15, we're talking about consider first things first. That is, the survey objectives and information needs should be the basis for selecting instrumentation, data collection, and processing methods. Next, value control very highly. The chance of catastrophic error increases dramatically with the number of people involved in the survey data collection. Third, communicate with others. Maintain a dialogue with the sponsor and obtain comments from those who can assist. Fourth one, evaluate options thoroughly. Questionnaire, data collection, and processing alternatives must all be identified and examined in order to make the best choice. Next, choose your alternatives carefully. If there's some doubt about the instrumentation, the data collection, or the data processing, you need to discuss this with your statistician. Next, place your trust in sampling. Don't use large samples when careful sampling design will obtain precise information from smaller numbers of people and at much less cost and taking much less time. Next to last, budget very carefully. Most things cost more than anticipated, and the budget should have a safety factor to allow for error. Finally, match your costs and the information value. Revise the project tasks or increase the funds allocated so that there's an adequate margin of safety between the costs and the benefits. I promise you, you don't want to spend a lot of money on low-value information. On the other hand, high-value information may require additional expenditure and should be so reflected in the agreed-upon budget at the outset. And now, having completed slide 15, I think it's time to take our first break and see if there's any questions that I can respond to by those of you who are participating in this particular webinar. So, Matt, I'll let you take the lead on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jack. And to all the attendees out there, if you do have any questions right now for Dr. ReVelle, please use the chat feature or Q&A feature found on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm going to point it out with my pointer to submit your questions, and we'll get to them in the order in which they're submitted. We do have a couple questions in the queue that I'd like to address right now. Jack, to follow up on something that you just talked about, how would one determine high value and low value, or how would one differentiate between high value and low value information?
That of course relates to the case that you're working on. If you know that certain types of information will be highly persuasive in the courtroom, to the jury, to the judge, that's certainly going to be high value. But if you anticipate, as a result of your experience and discussions with other attorneys, that a particular kind of information is not going to be persuasive in making your case, I would consider that low value. And then anything that's not high value or low value obviously must be medium value. But the bottom line for me, if I were an attorney, and I'm not, my wife is, but I'm not, is that will the information that you capture as a result of the survey research activity be sufficiently persuasive to make the strongest possible case when you're pleading it in court? And that, to me, is high value.
Okay, thank you, Jack. We have a couple more questions here. In what types of cases do you find that surveys are used most often?
I find that surveys are used most often when there is some kind of disagreement between the plaintiff and the defendant. The plaintiff may say that all of us ladies were not treated fairly with regard to benefits or with regard to salaries or with hours or time off. And what you need to do, of course, is to introduce a survey that would go out to both the ladies and gentlemen who are members of the organization with the same questions and see what kind of different opinions or perspectives they have with regard to the questions. If 90% of the ladies say we're not being treated fairly, and then you find a major difference between that and the type of answers that you get from the gentlemen, clearly you have a very different sort of situation. So any kind of time when you've got people who are not getting raises or getting certain benefits or are being treated in some undesirable way, and you want to find out if it's just that particular individual that's getting that type of treatment, or if it's an entire class of people, that's when you have to take the time to conduct a survey, because you've got one person's opinion versus a multitude of opinions. Let's say you've got an organization of 100 people, and 50% of the ladies and 50% of the men give you the same answers on a particular question. Well, you can see then at that point that there's very little difference between the way they perceive that they were treated. But if you find 80% of the women and 20% of the men, or vice versa, are coming up with a positive or negative statement, then you've got a basis for making the claim that the organization was treating people of different genders or of different education or of different ethnicities or whatever the case may be, sufficiently different that they are doing something that would be considered to be illegal.
Okay, thank you, Jack. We have a couple more questions, and like I said, I would encourage all of the attendees to submit their questions through the chat or Q&A feature. Jack, on what basis do you find your expert testimony, or have you seen surveys most frequently attacked by opposing counsel?
Well, I've seen them start to attack it, but unless they have someone on their side, and I can think of a case I was involved in through TASA about a year or 2 years ago, where I was representing the Franchise Tax Board, which is like the IRS in California, and the plaintiff was a company that felt that they had been overtaxed by the Franchise Tax Board. They had their statistician. He was a highly qualified statistician from a well-known name university, had excellent credentials. And then there was myself, and I felt that I had comparable credentials. And in going through the deposition, before we ever even got to court, I found the statistician making statements that I knew were wrong, and I pointed it out during the deposition. And the statistician for the opposing side, he bowed his head and said, "Oh my goodness, Dr. ReVelle is correct. I misspoke." Well, unless you've got a statistician to discuss statistical facts and figures, it's difficult for an attorney without a statistical background to challenge statements. If I say, this is the formula that you should be using, if I say, this is the type of design, sampling design you should be using, the opposing attorney has very little basis for discussing that. It's difficult, if not impossible, to challenge, primarily due to a lack of information. And so I think rather than answer the question as it was stated, I would restate the question and say, is it always necessary to have a statistician in your corner, on your side, when you're going to be facing the opposition that has conducted a survey? And I would say the answer would be yes, because in order to effectively discuss the pros and cons of what the opposition has done, you have to have a knowledge of what they should have done in order to make valid comparisons and say, this is where their design fell apart, or these are steps that they left out, or these are steps that should have been reversed. And so I've never been successfully challenged when I've done this, but only because either the opposition did not have a statistician in their corner, or because the statistician had inadequate experience or credentials to make a valid claim to the opposing attorneys or in court.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so why don't we continue on with the presentation of content on slide 17.
Okay. And by the way, for anybody who wonders where I'm making this presentation, I do most of my work for TASA in the western United States. My home is in the city of Orange, California, about 15 minutes from Disneyland. Now, I mention that only because I love it here. I know that's got nothing to do with the presentation, but I just thought I'd mention it. Okay, now we're ready to start on slide number 16. This starts the third unit in this first phase of research methods. And on slide 16, we're talking about the purpose of sampling. Well, as I noted earlier, it's an alternative enumeration, that is counting the entire population, also known as the census. Our Congress, for years and years and years, going back 20, 30, 40 years, through all sides of the political spectrum, has told the Census Bureau, you cannot use sampling, because they just don't understand that sampling will provide you as much or better information at much lesser cost and much faster. And as a result, we continue to have census every 10 years. It's costing we, the taxpayer, a lot of money, and the information is delayed by considerable time because of all the analysis that has to go through, all this data that's been collected. Just thought I'd toss that in. Sampling is a key factor for virtually any survey project. You know, the only time you might do a census is if you only got 10 or 20 people. But if you're talking about you've got 100 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, when I was the chief statistician for Hughes Electronics a number of years ago, and we had 80,000 employees, and we did a survey of the entire organization once a year, in addition to a very smaller samples during the year, we always used stratified sampling and cluster sampling in order to keep the time and the cost of our research down to a minimum and still get the kind of information that our company leadership and management required in order to do the best job possible. And of course, as you can see on slide 16, the main reason is economy of time, money, and personnel. Lastly, on slide 16, let's talk about reliability and validity. With validity, we're talking about bias, and with reliability, we're talking about accuracy or error. We'll examine the interrelationships between these on slide 17. So let's go to slide 17. And as you can see on the screen, we have a reliability validity diagram. And across the top, we're talking about bias or validity. And we're using these bullseyes, if you will, to facilitate their understanding of all the relationships. And down the left-hand side, you can see we're talking about accuracy or reliability, dependability. Now, we have a four-part matrix here with bias versus accuracy. When the bias or the validity is high and the accuracy is high, you end up with a very, very tight pattern, a pattern that says we're very, very accurate, and there's not much variation built into it. On the other hand, if you go across to the right side of the diagram, up in the top, where we're talking about low validity, but still high accuracy, we have this tight pattern, tight grouping, but they're located way, way off center. Now let's move down to the bottom left. Once again, we're dealing with accuracy, and in this case, we're talking about low accuracy. But we're also talking about a very poor validity, and as a result, you end up with a real spread there. It's highly accurate. You know, it's all surrounding the bullseye, but it's spread out. There's excess variation. Finally, way off target, down in the bottom right, we have a same excess variation, but this time with a very low validity, and as a result, we've got a spread of shots in our bullseye, in our target, and it's not only spread with excess variation, it's way off target as well, very, very low validity. So you can see that what we're trying to do when we're conducting a sample activity is to minimize the variation so that all the information is going to be centered around the bullseye, and we're also going to have a very tight pattern, so you're not going to have a great spread, and everything will be focused. The ideal, of course, is the top left, where you've got high validity and high reliability. From there on, it goes downhill. So there may be some questions on that later, so I'll just leave that for our discussion at the end of this presentation. And let's move on to slide number 18. And slide number 18, we're talking about 95% confidence intervals by sample size. Well, those of you who were able to participate in the first two webinars that I did for TASA will know about confidence intervals and sample size. But what I'll try to do for those of you who did not have the opportunity to sit in on that is let me discuss the graph here. You notice that across the horizontal axis, we're talking about sample size going from 0 to some much greater number. And down the left-hand side, we're talking about the percentage of the mean, where the mean is 100%, and below that is a lesser value of the mean, and above it is a greater value than the mean, which means that if you take a look at the very first line to the right of the left-hand axis, where you would normally expect to see a 20. You see a 0, and then a line without a number, and then a line with 40. Let's say that that's a sample size of 20, and you notice that the spread around the mean is humongous. I mean, tremendous excess variation, because in this particular case, we did not collect a sufficient sample size. But as the sample size increases from 20 to 40 to 60 to 80, et cetera, you notice that the 95% confidence intervals, that means that we are 95% certain, 95% confident that the true mean falls within that particular pair of points. So in the pair of points are the upper confidence limit with the dark line and the solid circles, and the lower confidence limit, which is the line with the clear or white circles. And as the sample size gets larger and larger, you notice that how those 2 points get closer and closer and closer, so that with the larger the sample size, the greater our confidence that we have in this 95% confidence that our mean is within those 2 points. It figures, though, if you think about it without numbers, logically, the more data you collect, the more certain you are that you're getting closer and closer to the true value. And for those of you who might remember, when you were back in high school, those two lines, the upper confidence limit and the lower confidence limit, are really asymptotic functions. That is, they get closer and closer to the mean without touching it as the sample size increases. There may be some questions about that too. But now let's move over to slide 19, still talking about designing the sample. Within the topic of sample size determination, little n depends on budget availability and the degree of confidence required. I've had several clients that say, oh, the confidence level doesn't matter that much. I can live with 80% or 90% confidence. Others say, oh, I got to have 95, 99, 99.99. And remember that the higher the confidence level that you require, the larger the sample size that you're going to have, as you just saw on slide 18. And as a result, the cost gets driven up quite a bit. So we need to have a discussion, that is the statistician and the attorney, to talk about what degree of confidence you want, and it's going to be a trade-off between the confidence required and the budget availability. And of course, I need to point out that any data that you collect is worthless if you collect less than the minimum N. Now you say, minimum N, where did that come from? Again, that's something I talked about in the first two webinars that I did for TASA. There's a certain minimum N that can be calculated very easily. There's some very simple mathematical formulas that can be used to determine what the minimum N is. You can always collect more than the minimum N, but that drives your cost up. But depending on your confidence level and the amount of error that you're willing to accept, you can calculate what that minimum N needs to be. Compare the cost of collecting the minimum N with your budget, and you've got a discussion going on. The object, as you can see on the slide, is to find the optimum point between the minimum N and the need for additional confidence. And what needs to be done in many cases is to iterate, go back and forth to determine the sweet spot where you're getting as close as you can to the confidence that you want, and what size N you're going to have to use to get it, depending on the amount of maximum allowable error that you and your client are willing to accept. And that takes us to the last item on slide 19, which is the sample selection methods. And we've talked about some of this before, the random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, and quota sampling. And I've got a couple of examples here. On slide 20, we'll talk about unclustered random samples, and on 21, we'll talk about clustered random samples. Now let's take a look at slide 20. In this case, the respondents, the people who are being surveyed, are selected randomly, or by convenience, although I personally do not recommend it. regardless of their physical or geographical location. On the other hand, on slide 21, we're talking about a clustered random sample, which is a series of physical or geographical areas which have been selected, and a specific number of sample units are selected proportionally from each cluster. Now, you recall in an earlier slide we said that we're talking about clusters. If you're talking about a single organization, then you're talking about maybe floors or departments or buildings. If you're talking about a large area, not more than a single organization, you may be talking about streets or neighborhoods, or even cities and states. So, clustered versus unclustered, again, that's something that you're going to need to discuss with your statistician in order to decide which way you want to go on that particular subject. And having discussed that, now we're ready to move over to slide number 22. Continuing to talk about designing the sample. On 22, we're talking about sample selection procedures. We can use random selection procedures, use an nth unit sampling, use random number generators, tables of random numbers, and physical selection methods. I'm not going to discuss that at length, but suffice to say that of all those, the nth unit sampling is probably the weakest. If you happen to select, say, we're going to look at every 10th unit or every 20th unit or whatever the case may be, and it happens that you just coincidentally line up with where a certain unusual factor may occur within the population of respondents that you are dealing with, then you're not going to catch whatever it is that you're looking for. You're much better off to use random selection procedures and generate the random numbers using a random number generator or a table of random numbers. A phone book is a great place to get random numbers, or some kind of physical selection method. But you want to make sure that when you're collecting your data for purposes of deciding who the target respondents are going to be, that you use a method that's going to, as much as possible, minimize any potential bias. Which takes us to slide number 23. We're talking about sample selection bias. Now, for purposes of making sure we're all on the same page, let me offer you two different definitions of bias. Bias is an inclination towards something or a predisposition, partiality, prejudice, preference, or predilection. Another way of looking at bias is that it's an inclination to present or hold a partial perspective at the expense of possibly equally valid alternatives. Anything biased generally is one-sided and therefore lacks a neutral point of view. Bias, we all know, can come in many forms. Having offered those two discussions of the meaning of bias, coming back to slide number 23, what are some of the biases that we can run into in sample selection? The sources of bias, controlling bias, accessibility bias, affinity bias, cluster bias. We talked about cluster. Cluster is terrific, but if you have a cluster and you say we're going to have all our clusters on the north side of town, well, what happened to the south side, or the east side, or the west side? You have to be careful with bias. No matter what things that you're doing, bias can creep in if you're not very careful. And that also includes non-response bias, order bias, self-election bias, termination bias, visibility bias. For example, let's say you go to a restaurant and you respond to a questionnaire and they want to know what you thought of the service, what you thought of the food. Well, remember, that's self-selection bias. They're only getting answers from people who want to answer. There are other people who won't answer, no matter what kind of incentive is being offered. Usually we find that in self-election bias, it's because somebody was extremely happy or extremely sad, disappointed. And so that can offer some very, very muddy responses to people who think they have a pretty good idea of what their customers are saying. Then we also have termination bias and visibility bias. So you can see, and I kid in my classes, and we have a problem with bias here at home. You know, bias this, bias that. Thank you for listening. I had to get that off my chest. That takes us over then to slide number 24. Finalizing our discussion on designing the samples, we'll summarize here. First, we talked about striving for reliability and validity, which we looked at extensively. Check each decision to determine if it will increase sampling error or introduce a systemic bias into the data. Second, identify components very precisely. The population, sample units, and sample frame must be described with clarity and precision. Third, determine the sample size carefully. Consider confidence required, population variance, analysis techniques, and the resources available for the project. Fourth, depend upon random sampling. The greater the deviation from random selection, the less legitimate and accurate the statistical analysis and reports will be. If you're an attorney in court or in deposition, and we're talking about a survey that has been conducted by the opposition, I promise you the most important question you can ask is, what random sampling process did you use? Don't ask them if they used it. They can just give you a yes or a no. Ask them what type of random sampling design was used to ensure validity or legitimacy of the results that you got. The fifth one, evaluate design refinements. Use stratification, clustering, order sampling, and special designs to increase reliability and decrease costs. That's just to let you know that there's more than just the things that I've been able to cover in the limited time that we have for this presentation. Next, use a trial survey when necessary. A pilot survey or sequential sampling will indicate the appropriate sample size if it can't be determined in advance. For example, if you don't know what the maximum allowable error is going to be, or if you don't know any one of a number of things that are required for the one or more of the formulas that are going to be used to determine minimum sample size, then a pilot survey or trial survey is a pretty good thing to use to bring you into the ballpark. Next to last, identify sources of bias. Be aware of the major sources of bias in your situation, but constantly inspect the design to be sure additional sources of bias aren't introduced. Finally, be creative and confident. Sampling design and size determination are more of an art than a science. Statistics is a science. Sampling design and size determination is truly more an art than a science, and you require the attention and the assistance of an experienced, well-educated, applied statistician. That completes the discussion. Let me give you some examples on slide 25. On slide 25, we're talking about three different phases. The first unit in phase one is that the attorney needs to find out what certain employees think or believe. You need your statistician to help you to design the survey to do all the various 10 elements in the survey to make sure that you're going to find out accurately what certain employees, by certain I mean stratified, whether it's by gender, by education, by position, by the number of years with the company, whatever the case may be. You want to find out what certain employees think or believe. In the second unit, let your SME, that's subject matter expert, statistician, estimate project parameters such as cost and duration before you start the thing. For goodness sake, if you as a TASA client, and you say, well, what's it going to cost me to do this? And the statistician pulls a number out of his hat and says it's going to cost you $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000. First thing you want to do is challenge it and say, okay, I'll buy that provided you can explain to me how you arrived at that number. Let them send you an email that describes, where those costs and the durations come from. If he says it's only going to take a week, or it's going to take a month, or it's going to take several months, you want to know that. And of course, the more data you collect, the longer it's going to take to complete the project, because you've got all that data to analyze and present and develop a report. And finally, in Unit 3 of Phase 1, that's your SME statistician design the survey sample for your review and approval so that you can be sure that what the statistician is doing is precisely what you need and what you want. And periodically, as a part of the agreement or contract that you establish up front, have a feedback session, whether it's once every 2 days or once every week or whatever the case may be. You want to know what kind of progress is being made. Are you on schedule? Are you on budget? So that things don't go out of control. And I think, folks, that's what I wanted to share with you on this, the first phase of this 4-phase discussion on research methods. When we get together next time, we'll be talking about Phase 2, developing survey instruments. That'll include item number 4, proposing a question, item number 5, creating item scales, and item number 6, constructing questionnaires. I'll look forward to having you join me at that time. And now, let's return to Matt and see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Thank you for a great presentation. As always, you came prepared and did a great job. For those who are on the line, if you have any final questions for Jack, please feel free to submit them through our Q&A or our chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of the screen. Jack, we do have a couple questions in the queue that I'd like to address right now. Jack, of these stages and these steps that you've talked about, where do you find that most of the pitfalls happen?
I didn't get the first part of that question.
Of the phases or steps that you identified during this presentation, where do most of the pitfalls happen?
Usually early on. If mistakes made early on compound themselves and multiply themselves, and later on, when it's too late, we find, for example, to use an example of manufacturing, where I come from, that a defect caught early may cost only $10. If it's caught at the next level of manufacturing, it may cost $100. And at the next level of $1,000, these pitfalls, the most important ones are the ones that occur early, and they need to be corrected. Because, for example, you may come up with a minimum sample size that's in error right up front, and then you end up sending out your questionnaires or having people do telephone interviews or whatever the case may be, and you find that you don't have enough data. Or, even worse, that you got too much data, that your minimum sample size was not correctly calculated, and as a result you committed yourself to far more work than was actually necessary to get the job done, to get accurate information. So where do the pitfalls occur? I find that early on, when you're determining your information needs, wouldn't it be terrible to have something that you really need to know, and you completely slips your mind, and the questionnaire goes out, the questionnaires come back, the data is analyzed, and then you say, well, what happened to X? And the statistician looks at you and said, we didn't ask any questions about X, you never brought that up. So early on, I cannot overemphasize the importance of making sure that you've got an accurate and complete assessment of what information you're looking for and how that data is going to be used to prove your case.
Okay, excellent. And we have a couple questions here about that ask how long putting together a survey should take on average. You probably don't want to get in. Each is probably independent of the other, but are there best practices that you can supply some of the attendees as a takeaway as they're thinking about putting together a survey, the information that they should come to the table with to move the first stage along?
Yeah, you're talking about in discussing it with the statistician?
That's correct, yes.
I would say that first of all they need to know 100%, or as close to 100% as they can get, of the type of information they're looking for. And do they need precise numbers, or will ranges of numbers be sufficient? How quickly do they need the information? For example, are they getting prepared for a deposition, or are they getting prepared for trial? So the attorney needs to know the anticipated schedule so that the statistician can respond honestly. It can't be done that quickly unless we increase the budget and use twice as many people or 3 times as many people. So in order to get the best judgments and most complete judgments from the statistician, the attorney needs to come armed with as much information as possible. And that includes how much budget is available. I've run into that problem before where I'll provide a number and the attorney says, my client will not pay that much. I can't do this for any more than X and 50% of X. I hate to say it, but there are no really good rules of thumb. Some surveys can be done in a week. Some surveys may take months. Some are going to be extremely costly. Some are not going to be very expensive at all. Everything is relative, Matt, and all you can do is, as an attorney, and I'm speaking now directly to the folks who are watching and listening, is to verify that the credentials and experience of the statistician that you're working with is sufficient to provide you with the kind of information that you need. And probably something I haven't talked about so far, and that is the chemistry. Are you comfortable working with the statistician? Do you feel that you can ask the statistician questions and rely on the fact that they will give you straightforward, honest answers and not beat around the bush? I wish I could offer you some kind of rule of thumb, but just like every person is different, every case is different. You could have 2 cases that presumably were about the same subject, but you have lots of different answers because the people are different, perhaps the circumstances are different, the venue is different. Something that happens in Florida is going to be different than something that happens in California. Even on the surface, it sounds the same. It turns out that the laws are different, or that there's so many variety of things that could happen that I would hate to mislead the attorneys who are participating in this particular webinar and say, oh, you should always do this or you should always do that. I apologize that I just cannot offer any real dramatic and dependable rules of thumb.
Okay, excellent. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so why don't we wrap up this afternoon's program. Jack, do you have any concluding remarks that you would like to make?
Sure. I hope that the people who participated found that it was worth their time, and that they'll plan on participating in the next webinar when we talk about Phase 2, developing survey instruments.
Okay, great. And thank you, Jack, for the time and the effort that you put into this, as well as the time that you've put into the previous programs and the time that you will put into the future programs. And thank you for all who took an hour out of your day to spend with us today. If you'd like to speak to Jack about a case or project that you're working on, you can contact us here at TASA. Our telephone number is 800-523-2319. As I indicated during the introduction, we will be sending out a link to the archive recording of this webinar tomorrow morning. The archive recording of this webinar and all of our previous webinars may be found in the TASA Knowledge Center. To get to it, visit tasanet.com and click on the Knowledge Center tab at the top of the page. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to send an email to me at mhyde@tasanet.com. We do take all of your comments under consideration, and they do help us to produce better programs. That being said, I think we've had a great program today, and we're going to end the program Please fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after you leave, and have a great day.